Hello everyone, today we talk about the November Uprising, also known as the November Insurrection or Polish-Russian War of 1830-31. This was a major armed rebellion by Poles against Tsarist imperial rule in the Congress Kingdom of Poland, often called also simply Kingdom at this point, a semi-autonomous state created at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 from territories of the former Duchy of Warsaw after the Napoleonic Wars. We are really getting into 19th century warfare more. I want to start from these. This is not such a secondary thing. It's more like a failed insurrection in the end, but it's a major moment in the history of the Polish nation, Polish sort of independentistic movements and nationalism. The aforementioned kingdom was in personal union with the Muscovite Tsar, also served as its king, right? But it was granted its own liberal constitution, one of Europe's most progressive at the time, by the way, with institutions including a separate parliament, the same army administration, courts, and broad civil liberties like, for example, press freedom and religious tolerance, favoring Roman Catholicism. Warsaw served as its capital with key sites such as the Belvedere Palace, the Grand Duke's residence, and the Infantry Cadet School in Łazienki Park. If you have visited Warsaw, you have a pretty sort of obvious idea of what we're talking about. However, and predictably, Tsarist emperors, first Alexander I and then Nicholas I, quickly eroded these guarantees, right, through censorship, secret police surveillance, suppression of patriotic groups, replacement of Polish officials with Russian ones, and disregard for the constitutional provisions, fostering deep resentment that exploded when the Tsarist Empire planned to use the Polish army against the July Revolution in France. And we need a bit more of context. That's why we're starting step by step to talk about all this stuff. And the Belgian Revolution as well, violating in this the Constitution's Article 2 of what had been established in Vienna for the Polish Congress. And so you understand the picture here. There were different waves of uprisings in Europe during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and more. There's also the January Uprising, as you know, in Polish history was smaller, but in that sense mirroring also the Iron Fist having increased from the 30s further on the Poles by the Tsars. There is an order that has been established after the end of the Napoleonic era that is very difficult to be kept together. Right, and this is, again, the age of rampant national feelings, of independent struggles that are going to erode, essentially, the system that, as you see here with the Poles, had been partially preserved, not to confer the Tsarist Empire an overwhelming force and power. The 19th century is also the moment in which the concept of geopolitics, the only intelligent one that was ever crafted, considering the later, especially the most recent updates, so to say, revolving exactly around this from sort of outer perspective, including the American plan and so on, around Central, Eastern Europe, this big space between the Baltic and the Black Sea, that, as we know, even today, still think the same object of content that had been also a major arena during the Napoleonic era, whereby it was understood, think about the Cold War in the 20th century, that whoever controlled that space in general, given, because geopolitics obviously does not exist, let's say considering the overall distribution of Western civilization and sort of an agglutinating Tsarist force and so on, that whoever controlled that space, I will make a video about that, would have essentially the upper hand and the strategic balance of the system. Right? To prove that geopolitics does not exist is that obviously the Cold War was won by the West anyway, and there isn't just Europe, but also in case of conventional warfare. I'm not going to, never really particularly a fan of Tom Clancy's or fiction in general, but you know what we're talking about. We shall make some video about, I don't know, the Fulda Gap, the various Warsaw Pact plans that were desecrated by the Poles after the end of the Cold War, to show exactly what were the plans, invasion of the West, what kind of problems, kind of sort of ideas so existed there. So when you talk 19th century, you're actually looking not at some sort of remote time in history where you look at Poland erased from the map during the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century. We're talking something very, very direct. When you look at countries of 40 million inhabitants today in Central Europe, next door to Ukraine and to essentially the Russian sphere of influence and so on, you realize that whatever it is, it's incredibly actual, right? We should make also more general videos. I actually started, we're about to get there with the lottery, especially if we, because I already prepared these videos, but we slow down a little that side. But in plain 19th century history, because the era around Warsaw, as a matter of fact, was an island of industrialization that the same Tsars at some point somehow invested in, because Poland was a dangerous thing, right, to keep under in general. Mostly we're looking also at Prussia. The least developed part of partition had ended up under the Habsburgs, that also did not rule, especially part of Poland, very well. Actually, Galicia was pretty well handled, and also made some videos about Ukrainian national identity, starting from that corner of the Habsburgic Empire. But Warsaw was, again, differently from most of Central and Eastern Europe at this point, particularly industrialized and or towards industrialization, at least by sort of the degrees of this era. I mean, the 1830s are an incredibly early period for that as well. So there was not just a pretty strong Polish national sentiment, but also a big system that needed to be considered and maintained under control. There is obviously also the bigger picture of the 1830s revolutions that did not happen just there. We just mentioned France, Belgium. And what is fascinating about these movements, a bit less for Poland, like in this case, is that there is a great deal of complexity especially in as much as today's political beliefs are actually considered. Like, nationalism was essentially a fourth estate, radical, terroristic, red ideology at the time. And it was truly championed by communists at large. So understood in this way, like, most people don't even know this, because let's completely stop presuming that anybody learns these things from school or from anywhere else. But also, in fact, the broader national cause there is something can't be dismissed. We're looking mostly at certain higher estates that understood, especially in these countries where there wasn't properly a national independence, that the latter would be obviously the most important and viable opportunity for their people. It was ever more self-aware and taking on, in fact, ever more kind of mass dimension. There is still there is an international rivalry between these various peoples, countries, and yet these revolts are very much coordinated across Europe. There is a Napoleonic experience that had spread the ideals of revolution, but at the end of the day had never quite been, especially in the moment in which Napoleon arrived in places like Warsaw, a matter of mere revolution or radical Jacobinism. Right, was something very, of course, anti-traditional for the time, but it also carried the wealth of success, of actual power. The same Tsar after Austerlitz, as we've seen in our series about the war of the Third Coalition, literally told Napoleon that he was a man predestined by heaven. It can be interpreted in different ways, but that was definitely a praise and admiration after, by the way, Napoleon's greatest masterpiece for that matter. There is a great deal of historical rivalry even among the allies that fight against Napoleon. I mean, just think about Prussia, Russia, Austria, etc., that had been fighting, like in previous generations, against one another, including against France. And France that participates to the Congress of Vienna as a defeated country, but maintaining essentially the sort of her own integrity as a major power, as an empire, just sort of being apparently normalized, a bit like the entire system that had known the constitutional experiences. This first ideas of properly identifying as a core, for example, in a flag, in a unitary flag, right? In the Ancien regime, there were royal flags, but these were mostly understood as properly of the royal house, yes, also representing a state as it was mounting up, right? But everything was mostly like different peoples that followed sort of old costumes, and that rulers were called to respect and sort of so to exercise in terms of justice, of order. The way I talk about revolution, rights, Napoleon, all this stuff, so you can look at how way more complex than, for example, the Burkean perspective that is the most pushed, especially in the Anglo-American world, and most of my audience comes from there. It's important to recover a bit what was actually happening in continental Europe and all the nuance of this whole. So I think that you will like the story if you have never heard about the Polish insurrections. They're beautiful as dramatic, as great part of also Polish history, and also pretty recent Polish history, as we've seen also in the videos about Reagan, Thatcher, and Wojtyla. Now, the November Uprising erupted in the evening hours of November the 29th, 1830, when Sub-Lieutenant Piotr Wysotsky entered the Warsaw Infantry Cadet School in Łazienki Park during a tactics lesson, interrupted the instructor, and delivered a short, fiery speech under the equestrian statue of King John III Sobieski, that, of course, we covered very much in depth for our series about the 1683 siege of Vienna, but I should actually make an overall video a bit also about other rulers telling the truth, but also in his case, his entire military curriculum, because it's quite fascinating. And Wysotsky, at this point, thundered, quote, "Poles, the hour of vengeance has struck. Today we must die or conquer. Let your breasts become the Thermopylae for the enemies." The cadets, numbering around 180 in the school, immediately armed themselves from the garrison stores and were joined by a small civilian group of young intellectuals already part of the conspiracy, because also there the Third Estate is obviously bringing some intelligentsia next to the aristocracy. Poland naturally is not a particularly socioeconomically advanced country at large. We said that, yes, Warsaw was a pretty advanced center, like a cathedral in the desert, really, of the surrounding country, including the areas populated, say, by the Germans around. And when you look at that, because, I don't know, it's not like Prussia was particularly progressive in many ways. I also made videos about the creation of the secret police, like the forerunner of essentially secret agencies with Stäbe, etc. It's basically this context, all right? And you understand also the reason for this uprising. Now we'll see better how it unfolded, but it was a moment of severe turmoil in Europe, and the Poles, under the relatively liberal regime, safeguarded by the restoration order, thought they could break free from the Tsarist power at this point. So receiving some kind of external support. And among these, by the way, in civilians that backed the military in this uprising was Ludwik Nabielak, Severin Goszczynski, and Leonard Rettel. The entire force, still modest in size, because Łazienki was, again, like there is this great park where also military expeditions used to start from the palace of the kings, and there down this enormous alley that now is in the city, but it's at the time was in open countryside south of the city, and so this was a good area for military maneuvers that were always a risky business if you consider, again, that this was technically part of the Tsarist Empire, but it had its own local army for that matter. This is naturally was normal, would continue also later. We will talk about, I don't know, Mannerheim. Think about what he did for Finland. He started as a Tsarist cavalry officer, as a matter of fact. Very international still, again, like in the Tsarist Empire, the old mold. There were lots of foreign noblemen, as you know. We've seen it recently with Jomini, that was in fact around. Von Clausewitz, brief mention, because he also died, as you know, in the aftermath, during this issue that involved also Prussia, of illness, because that was normal at the time, more than getting a musket ball in the chest. So this entire force, still modest in size, moved swiftly towards the Belvedere Palace, the principal residence. Belvedere is literally how it's transliterated. It would be the Belvedere, just like in Vienna, Prince Eugene's palace and so on. This was the principal residence of the Grand Duke Constantine Pavlovich, who exercised, so these were obviously the Tsarist supervisors, who exercised the de facto vice-regal authority over the Congress kingdom and held supreme command of its army. They were responsible for all of this. But, it was an army of Poles, largely. The attackers forced entry into the palace grounds and penetrated the building itself. But Constantine, that had escaped moments earlier, reportedly disguised in women's clothing, provided by his Polish wife, Joanna Gruzinska, or by servants. Well, in any case, it's not that important. In the confusion and rage that followed, the insurgents killed several high-ranking Polish officers who refused to side with the rising, which was also a thing. There were some loyalists, because they were obviously colluded with the regime. They had privileges and position, and that thought themselves to a degree. Some of them were sort of Polish patriots to the extent that they believed that at least cultivating this relation within the multinational Tsarist empire could bring at some point to some further Polish autonomy. These were early eras to reason in those terms, but hey, the revolutions were already around. I will not digress more on sort of the paradoxes of the restoration of the Congress of Vienna, but these events are quite eloquent. They were under oath anyway to these people. Such things like there is hardly a better word for 19th century values describing properly the entire belief of the time survived until World War I, and for also deterioration of traditional ideas such as duty, right? You don't have to think what you have to do. If you have sworn an oath, unless, again, there are some higher reason, more sort of higher thinking or whatever you wanted to justify this, like, you die sword in hand. Some of these generals who were killed by the same insurrectionists were, for example, Stanisław Trębicki, Maurycy Hofke, Stanisław Potocki, Ignacy Blumer, Tomasz Siemiątkowski, and Józef Nowicy, together with the Russian general Alexei Dzandru, who was bayoneted inside the palace. The violence claimed 6 Polish generals in all must shot or cut down in the courtyards and corridors. From Belvedere, the insurgents marched directly to the main arsenal on Volga Street. This was obviously particularly important to provide their own forces with most of the ammo of the army to preclude its use also to other opponents. After a brief but determined struggle against the small guard detachment, they seized the building and began distributing muskets, sabers, and ammunition to the crowds of armed civilians, artisans, students, shopkeepers, and workers who had begun streaming into the streets in response to the sounds of fighting. Naturally, a great part of Warsaw was with this, right, is a general patriotic feeling as a sort of natural resistance against Tsarist oppression. And naturally, this was really normal. If you rose up, there was a professional military, and then to safeguard the situation, you had to arm a largely supporting population to guard the city, the most important one. By dawn on November the 30th, the remaining Tsarist troops in Warsaw, together with Constantine's loyal Polish units, had been forced to withdraw northward beyond the city limits, leaving the capital entirely under insurgent control. First step, mission accomplished. The episode, soon known across Poland as the November Night, or in this sense, Noc Listopadowa, converted a long-maturing military conspiracy organized inside the cadet school as early as 1828 into an open citywide national insurrection that spread with extraordinary rapidity, confirming the Polish national sentiment towards the Tsarist Empire. The spark that ignited the action was the Tsarist government's plan to employ the army of the Congress Kingdom to suppress, as we were saying before, the July Revolution in France and the Belgian Revolution then underway, a deployment expressly prohibited by Article 2 of the 1815 Constitution, so established by the time of Vienna, unless expressly authorized by the Sejm itself, so obviously with essentially the permission of the Polish parliament. This tells you again how complicated the situation was also from the Russian side, because again, you can't hide Poland, or you can't cancel it from the maps, but this is a massive territory with also a pretty consistent population. It's not like, I don't know, it was even more densely populated than the Tsarist Empire at large, and that had this strong ambitions, connections. There was a general, as you know, feeling between the French and the Poles, not just because, of course, of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw under Napoleon, but because, as we've seen also with Jan Sobieski, in general, the Poles and the French, even before that, we've seen it with Henry III of France during the wars of religion in France, how the French, especially also from a military standpoint, right, sending advisors, even guard units to Poland, had always been fundamentally flirting and or siding with the Poles. Now, the 1815 Constitution, granted at the Congress of Vienna and regarded at the time as one of the most progressive in Europe, had been eroded almost from the moment it was promulgated, because you can't really expect the Russians to do otherwise. Alexander I, for example, never underwent a formal coronation as King of Poland. So he didn't even recognize a Polish nation, even though, again, he would have actually, as we've seen, in Crown Union, could have boasted that, right? But even doing that would have essentially equated to recognize the Poles as a people, which they deemed to be, he deemed to be too politically dangerous. Instead, in fact, the Tsar appointed his brother Constantine as effective viceroy in 1815 and systematically disregarded the document's guarantees as well. Press freedom was suppressed in 1819 through preventive censorship. Freemasonry was outlawed in 1821. Secret police surveillance under Senator Nikolai Novosiltsev expanded after the 1823 breakup of student societies in the taken lands, and from 1825 onward, same debates were held in secret. So while Polish aristocracy had always been somehow private, oligarchic, and shady in this regard, it was also still something, and very much at the basis also of the national military. Polish patriotic organizations and the liberal Kalizania faction were dissolved by the Tsars, officers subjected to public humiliations as well, and important administrative positions gradually transferred to Russians, all despite Constantine's personal union with Polish society at large through his marriages with Joanna Gruzinska. In the immediate aftermath of the Administrative Council, the kingdom's civilian executive convened to restore order and prevent escalation into full-scale war. Prince Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, Julian Orysyn Niemcewicz, and General Józef Włopicki replaced several unpopular ministers. Loyalist voices initially prevailed in seeking a negotiated settlement with Constantine, who had retreated with his suite to the village of Wierzbno, and refrained from launching an immediate counteroffensive against the city that would have naturally weakened also Tsarist presence. When Czartoryski informed the council that Constantine appeared willing to forgive the insurgents and settle matters amicably, radicals led by Maurycy Monacki reacted with fury instead. On December the 3rd, Moshnasky mounted a large public demonstration in Warsaw, openly denounced the ongoing talks, and demanded the formation of a revolutionary government together with an immediate military expedition into Lithuania. His argument was strategic. Transferring the war to Lithuanian soil would spare the Vistula province's devastation, preserve local grain stocks for the insurgents, and exploit the patriotic sentiment still strong in the eastern provinces that had once belonged, in fact, to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The meeting adopted a series of demands to be presented to the Administrative Council, including the establishment of a revolutionary authority and the prompt expulsion of Constantine's forces. Under mounting pressure, the Administrative Council was dissolved on December the 3rd. A provisional government took shape that incorporated Moshnasky, Joachim Lelewel, and several of their associates from the newly formed Patriotic Society. To confer legitimacy on these changes, the provisional government ordered the convocation of the Sejm on December the 5th, proclaimed General Józef Krzopiski, recently retired from the army because of his struggles, his conflict with Constantine, dictator of the uprising. Krzopiski, a veteran of the Napoleonic campaigns that were just 20 years before, and who had earned distinction at Somosierra and elsewhere, the Poles had, as you know, been exiles from a long time, because at that point many of them had already abandoned the country after the partitions and fighting for Napoleon, accepted the dictatorship reluctantly. He regarded the entire enterprise as an act of collective madness, overestimated Tsarist military power, and underestimated both the depth of revolutionary fervor and the organizational capacity of the Polish movement. His temperament, remember what we said before, there were many Poles who were absolutely hating, like the new leader here, the Tsarists, but that realized that in the moment Poland was not adequately equipped to simply rise up and successfully obtain independence, or at least a better constitution, or the respective of the 1851. By the way, Krzopiski's temperament and convictions inclined him towards accommodation with the Tsarist Empire rather than open war. He took command principally to preserve internal stability, because he had the chevrons, the qualifications definitely for doing that. So given this aura of institutionalism, like as an important figure that had been close to Constantine, in this sense to prevent anarchy, because naturally the insurrection in itself can be dangerous for everyone involved, and salvage whatever remained of the 1815 constitution, in fact, through negotiation. That was his greatest goal. So Piski's first act was thus to send Prince Franciszek Ksawery Drucy Lubitsky at the head of a delegation to St. Petersburg itself. That, at the time, as you know, was the capital of the Tsarist Empire. The mission carried instructions to demand strict observance of the 1815 constitution as a standing ground of Polish requests and red lines, so to say, extension of its provisions to the taken lands, namely Lithuania, Belarus, and right bank Ukraine. This aspect is quite fascinating because it naturally aimed at re-extending Polish control on what had been the previous lands of the Commonwealth at large. Convocation of the Sejm, including deputies from those provinces, interestingly enough, so including again Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and immediate withdrawal of all Tsarist troops from the kingdom's territory. This was actually even a sort of a stronger stand than was probably realistic, but put in this situation, the dictator thought that at least could satisfy everybody involved. Also because the uprising in itself was a major crisis for the Tsarist Empire, to say the least. Meanwhile, the dictator deliberately refrained from offensive operations because he thought that something could be substantially negotiated at this point. He, in fact, declined for this reason to expel the Tsarist garrisons from Lithuania, as it had been prospected, as we've seen, and even authorized Constantine's unmolested departure with his remaining loyal forces. that weren't even this big deal. Radicals within Warsaw and the patriotic society pressed relentless for a war of complete liberation and incorporation of the lost eastern territories instead. You understand how, again, extremistic, even for sort of ideally a positive cause, the sort of nationalistic movement was. There is, as prospected, the tension between the true aristocrats, the true noblemen, the elite, that so also the entire matter from a more international and practical perspective, and then the unhinged nationalistic popular third estate guided but also fourth estate fueled idealism. At least the fourth estate sort of had a sort of different idea, and paradoxically in that sense also not much of an understanding of what a national identity, a unitary national identity in particular, really meant. This is a topic that we will look at better in different circumstances. You don't have, however, to make the mistake that these people did not own, in fact, different perspectives at the same time that today we would deem to be incongruent or opposite. Several years of YouTube history videos, I realized that the greatest difficulty that people have is to properly contextualize ideology. All right, and create some anachronistic monsters in their head. Now, on December the 13th, 1830, the Sejm had already proclaimed a national uprising against the Tsarist Empire. When Druski Lubecki returned on January the 7th, 1831, bearing Nicholas I's uncompromising demand for unconditional surrender, quote, the Poles should throw themselves upon the grace of their emperor. This is the attitude that the Tsars always had till the very end. Right, like Nicholas II, that simply, met by the British ambassador just before the main explosion of the Russian Revolution. Said maybe you should make you could try to earn more the trust of your people, and the Tsar answered, it's the people who has to earn my trust. That's the mentality there. And naturally here there's even the Poland has, right? The fact that the Poles were, this nightmare of the Russians to begin with, this country that could not afford to exist, a bit like Ukrainians. Wołyski at this point resigned just the following day after the Tsar's response, because he understood that this was just too much, right? Even to bear, think about all the responsibility on your shoulders. He said, I don't want it to be on my head. Because he understood what the ultimate outcome of this would likely be, right? It was wall against wall, and so he was going at war. Authority now passed decisively to the radicals, grouped in the Patriotic Society under Joachim Lelewel. On January 25th, 1831, the Sejm adopted the Act of Dethronement of Nicholas I. Interestingly enough, the Poles were saying, we throw you out of here, thereby terminating the personal union and declaring the Polish nation sovereign and independent, with the right to confer its crown upon a ruler who would respect sworn civic liberties. And this is a very interesting mix of sort of revolutionary constitutionalism and, however, a more traditional idea that was alive, especially in parts of Central Europe like Poland, more than even among other Central European countries, in the older legal framework of antiquity, of the Middle Ages, meaning that as a people we have a right. It's basically common law, if you want. Have a right. It is after the age of Napoleon, and naturally had, at least not much in Central Europe, but elsewhere, changed a lot in terms of state centralization. And we decide which ruler is fit to preserve our rights, to exercise justice, to hold us, but we are the ones who decide. This is a very, again, coherent view, by the way. The proclamation explicitly stated that, quote, the Polish nation is an independent people and has a right to offer the Polish crown to him whom it may consider worthy. So it's exactly that degree of liberty, of arbitrium, that the Tsars could not conceive in absolute terms. On January the 29th, a national government was constituted under Prince Adam Jerzy Czartoryski. General Michał Gedeon Rajewiecz was appointed commander-in-chief in succession to Łupiński, who briefly resumed field command of the army. Tsarist intervention commenced on February 4, 1831, when Field Marshal Hans Karl von Diebitsch led an army of roughly 115,000 men and 336 guns across the frontier. This is a massive force to quell properly a regional uprising. The first battle of operational importance in this war took place on February 14th near Stoczek Wukowski on the Brest-Warsaw road. General Józef Dwernicki, commanding a mobile division that had crossed the Vistula on February 10th with the intention of raising Volhynia, interestingly enough, in the southeast, learned of Baron Theodor Geismar's mounted Jäger division advancing to intercept him. Here, it's important to stress that the Poles had their own fully fledged army, right? Or at least like a provincial force that could be bolstered by further levies, but with professional corps. It's very different from the January Uprising that was sort of much more romantic. But at this point, the Poles had a proper force that later, in fact, was disbanded. Dwernicki selected a defensive position north of the town during the night of February the 13th to the 14th, placing his 6 3-pounder guns in a continuous east-west line, infantry in squares on the flanks, the western square anchored on dense forest, and his 14 Ulan squadrons deployed to cover all approaches. The narrow woodland tracks forced the Tsarist columns to march in trees, separating Geismar's two brigades and preventing mutual support. At first light, Pashkov's Peresliav mounted Jäger regiment appeared from the northeast and immediately came under precise Polish artillery fire. Pashkov dismounted his first troop to shield the guns and sent his second troop against the northern Polish Ulan detachment, but the Russian cavalry broke almost at contact and fled towards Geismar's position, disordering their own reinforcements. When Geismar arrived from the east, his regiments were caught in a pincer between retreating squadrons and advancing Polish lancers. All right, I made a video about the Lipka Tatars. As a matter of fact, it's a broader sort of ethnic specialty of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Also, Poland at this point in history, in later times, up to World War II, this had been arguably the best riders of the Napoleonic era, since there was nothing to kid about with them. It's at that point that Russian cohesion collapsed. Geismar was left exposed on the field before escaping. Polish losses amounted to 46 killed and 59 wounded. Tsarist casualties included approximately 280 dead, 230 prisoners, and the loss of 8 guns. The engagement marked the first time regular Tsarist cavalry had been routed by Polish forces in the uprising. Right? Again, Polish cavalry, magnificent as always. Warsaw erupted in jubilation at the news, week-long festivities featuring fireworks and public speeches celebrating Dwernicki's defeat of Geismar, to whom Tsarist propaganda had portrayed as one of their most capable vanguard commanders following his exploit in the 1828-29 Russo-Turkish War. And so this was a great stain on Tsarist military reputation and political image. Smaller but heartening actions continued, by the way, through February. On February the 17th at Dobre, General Jan Skrzydnicki repulsed General Georg von Rosen's 6th Corps after 5 hours of combat on a forest clearing reachable only through narrow defiles. Polish losses stood at about 300 men, Russian at 755. The same day, near Kavuzhin, General Franciszek Zimirski's division executed effective delaying actions against Karl Wilhelm von Toll's vanguard, both sides suffering only light casualties, though. Between February the 19th and the 20th, the first Battle of Wawr pitted Zimirski and Piotr Schembach against elements of the Russian First Corps in an indecisive but encouraging check. On February the 24th to 25th, General Ivan Shakovskoy's 11,000 men corps suffered a sharp defeat at Białowieża in exceptionally savage bayonet fighting that contemporary accounts described as the most ferocious hand-to-hand combat of the entire war. Right here, the Poles bit the blip out of the Russians. The decisive defensive engagement, however, would occur before the capital. We are on February 25th at Olszynka Grochowska, known as the Battle of Grochow, in wooded and marshy ground on the eastern outskirts of Warsaw. Here, General Józef Wołyński, though nominally subordinate to Mikhail Radziwiłł, exercised actual command over approximately 36 to 40,000 men, many of them fresh, ill-equipped volunteers, and 115 guns of mixed calibers. As you understand, by the way, here, and this is the age of it, we've seen it also in the previous battles with those bayonet charges, the force of the masses, of the people matters, like moral forces matter. This is of course, the Clausewitzian paradigm is truly valid for all history of warfare, but these clashes sort of pointed out what had been unlocked by the French Revolution in the Napoleonic era in terms of mass warfare. And so the bigger titanic force that had been unlocked from the Fourth Estate in an unprecedented fashion. And so numbers do matter, right? Field Marshal Dibich disposed during this battle 59 to 60,000 men and 178 guns, reinforced in the afternoon by Shakovskoy's battered corps arriving from the Białowieża direction. After the Polish counterstroke in the aforementioned battle on February 24th, compelled Dibich to abandon his original plan of assaulting Warsaw on February 26th, the Tsarists advanced in 5 infantry corps supported by cavalry. The main effort struck the Polish center, divisions under Chrzynski and Zhymirski, while General Paweł Palin attempted to turn the southern flank held by Rzembek. By the way, here the Tsarist names, because they were also essentially Russians by that point, but they are old names, I don't know, German or French. You have this frequent names from the nobility of all of Europe, Italian, the same populations that, as we've seen, had been co-opted in certain posts from the nobility. Now, Joseph Ben Congreve rocket batteries that, as you know, were of British origin during the Napoleonic War. They were successfully employed first in India, then in the Old War's battlefield, disrupted in this fashion, like from the air, several Tsarist cavalry charges. Interestingly enough, Polish infantry concealed among trees and underbrush inflicted heavy losses on advancing columns whose artillery found clear lines of fire obstructed by the terrain instead. After almost 2 full days of continuous bloody combat, both armies disengaged, Dibich withdrawing towards Zytlce, the Poles falling back into Warsaw with losses that were severe and roughly comparable. Polish estimates range from 6,900 to 12,000 killed and wounded. Russian at least 9,500 and likely more, as a matter of fact. This demonstrated that the Poles know how to bleed and how to have the enemy bleed. And although tactically a draw, in fact, achieved this major strategic success for the Poles by forcing Dibich to abandon any immediate attempt to storm the capital on the Vistula. Wołyński, seriously wounded during the fighting, by the way, relinquished command to Chrzynski. Under Chrzynski, the Polish army conducted a limited but locally successful spring offensive along the Brest highway, the ones from which the Russians had come from. Victories were registered at the Second Battle of Wawer, March the 31st, Debe Wielkie on the same day, the Second Battle of Kałużyn on April the 2nd, Domanice on April the 10th, and Igani on the same day, were skillfully executed flanking movements and well-timed cavalry charges from the Poles inflicted significant damage on Tsarist formations. Again, the Poles unchained and resorting to their brilliant cavalry maneuvers. This naturally stemmed from the quality, again, of the Polish military after the Congress of Vienna, and obviously provided with a very specific prodrome for legitimizing the disbandment of these forces after the insurrection from the Tsarist side. Now, General Józef Dwerzyński's independent corps continued to win engagements in Volhynia, Puławy on March the 2nd, Kurów on March the 3rd, Porysk on April the 11th, and Boromel on the 18th, the 19th of April. Though these remained peripheral operations after all, because most of the enemies stood directly in the east, not much in the southeast of Poland. Chrzynewski, however, repeatedly suspended offensive momentum at critical junctures, persuaded that decisive foreign diplomatic intervention, above all from France and Britain, that were the most sympathetic already at that point to the Polish cause, and as we've seen also with France, had been historically more sensitive, not just to the sort of this more liberal ideas, but in fact the cause of Polish insurrection aligned with such worldview would compel the Tsarist Empire to accept a compromise settlement. Right, this would turn to be a pretty severe mistake. Right, public sympathy for Poland was naturally vocal in Paris, where meetings under Lafayette collected funds. In London and in the United States as well. Yet, this was in an age during which revolution had really meant a lot for these countries, where Britain, a bit less, had brought mostly problems, obviously, but the British were all very wary of sort of Tsarist empire sort of threatening Northern Europe, also from which a lot of tonnage in terms of construction material came from the forests of Scandinavia. Didn't have to be threatened. It had been enough to have lost Boston 40 years before. But if you're interested a bit in the development of that, I also have an ongoing series on the Crimean War that is just 20 years away. And so there you see also the relation between all these various powers and Tsarist Empire. So remember how fresh, as we've seen, there are literal Napoleonic generals fighting in the insurrection, the revolutionary experience had historically been, and how close, like the 50s, the 60s, so times like the ones of the Crimean War, of the Second Italian War of Independence, but in the United States, the American Civil War were. So very interesting sort of becoming phase of European warfare, doctrine, etc. Naturally, in Central Eastern Europe, warfare was a bit more rustic, but by this point already, more or less, Europeans fought in the same identical way, aside from this ethnic units here and there, especially in this region. There is an interesting testing there of for example, the Tsarist military, of insurrectional capacities in general across Europe, also for the sake of counter-insurrection, and aside from sympathies towards the Poles, right? The governments, however, of Louis-Philippe and Palmerston withheld material support, right? Because they were preoccupied in this sense, in fact, with preserving the European balance, first and foremost, which at the time mostly aimed at preventing any revival of French revolutionary influence that might weaken the Tsarist Empire as a future counterweight, right? This strategic balance shifted unavoidably, you can argue, or at least irreversibly, on May the 26th at Ostrowenka, one of the largest engagements of the November Uprising. Chrzynewski's army was divided by the Narew River. General Thomas Wubieński's 5th Infantry Division and Ludwik Bogusławski's 4th Line Infantry Regiment remained east of the town, with instructions to hold through the day, despite facing forces 4 times their strength. From 9 a.m., Russian columns under Nostitz, Berg, Nabokov, Lopukhin, Manderstjerna, and Shakovskoy drove the defenders back toward the river crossings. The 4th Regiment, thereafter celebrated as the Chavartatsy, together with 2 batteries, defended the burning streets in close quarters combat, repulsing successive waves of infantry and cavalry. These Poles were really fighting for their own country. And consider, again, the story of the same in the previous generations. I mean, the partitions were fresh in the memory of these people's parents, if anything, grandparents. So it was really a huge deal. That's where these peoples are tested. By late afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bem maneuvered his 4th Mounted Artillery Battery into a position immediately behind the hills west of the Narev. The guns opened at extremely close range, firing 250 rounds of grape shot, in fact, in canister that cut swathes through Russian grenadier ranks and created the impression of hidden Polish reserves at the same time. And instead, they were holding on with minimal forces. Naturally, grenadiers cut to pieces are also what you would expect as exposing as a grenadier, but in this sense, it was a very much asymmetrical and unexpected attack at literally mid-high at close range. So it was literally, pieces of people flying everywhere. And Dibich, under cover of darkness, withdrew most of his troops from the river bank. So this was actually great, theatrically speaking. Although, however, the town remained in nominal Polish possession at dusk, and raw losses were comparable, because also the Poles had suffered. This battle proved like the turning point, because the Tsarist reinforcement capacity at that point remained virtually inexhaustible, while Polish casualties could not be made good. As we've seen here, forces are also relatively contained. Again, it's not like the Poles really have a complete control over even the entire historical Polish national territory, because this thing, by the way, happened from the Russian side, quote unquote. But naturally, Poland was also largely in Prussia. It was also in other parts where there hadn't been a war. So we're looking at something similar to the Grand Duchy of Warsaw back in Napoleon's times, or even actually a smaller and less controllable part. And this withdrawal essentially shattered morale, right? Shrinetsky's subsequent hesitation permitted cholera-weakened Tsarist forces to recover and concentrate. Guerrilla warfare persisted on the peripheries, because there is a very interesting story that we'll cover at some point about properly peasant uprising itself. I mean, guerrilla scythe, the famous scythe, this was a bit of symbol of the Polish agrarian society, and so the symbol of a peasant world that would side with the independentistic nationalistic cause. In many ways, these were just sort of roughly brought into the struggle. In the Augustov and Plosk voivodeships, roughly 8,000 partisans in small, highly mobile forest detachments tied down large numbers of Tsarist right-wing troops. Think even about World War II and even the aftermath of World War II, because we think at some point, 1945, fall of Berlin, guns end, right? Not quite much in the sense that there were anti-communist guerrilla movements for years in Central Eastern Europe against the Soviets and their puppet regimes, right? We have to talk about those. And saying this because these landscapes, by the way, were not that different 100 years later, and that's how close we are to those events, right? Now, the guerrilla warfare persisted. You have Colonel Joseph Zalewski's sharpshooter groups in the Green Forest, specialized in ambushes against supply trains. Interestingly enough, these were all volunteers at large. There were also some professional soldiers, but in general, it also comes from the rustic background of these guys. We've seen, the Pennsylvania, Kentucky riflemen of the U.S. War of Independence. So we're not even that far away. But there were also larger formations operating, for example, under Mikhail Godlewski, approximately 1,000 men, and Majors Karol Schon and Antony Pushat up to 4,000 that were annihilated in this case on April the 22nd at Mariupol. Bloody uprising. On Žemaitija and Lithuania, youthful Countess Emilia Plater commanded side-armed insurgents and became a national emblem of heroic sacrifice. I have some pictures in the video about her as well. Separate companies of selected riflemen. It's important to stress riflemen because you know that still the line infantry used the smoothbore. And I made multiple videos about light infantry in Napoleonic warfare. I referenced before to the Kentucky Pennsylvania riflemen. These were, again, the elite sharpshooters under Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Kuzel and Majors Eustachy Grotus and Stanisław Krzyżimowski, providing probably with the top skirmishing support when attached to regular units as well, because, of course, as we were just referencing to those videos, there was a proper way to integrate them into major open field engagements. Now, Tsarist repression in all of this was unrelenting. Officers taken armed were summarily executed. Szlachta estates, so these were the Polish nobility's possessions, confiscated with owners sent into exile. Peasants subjected to flogging or conscription into Siberian battalions. Villages supportive of the insurgents burned to the ground, and local old believer and Jewish communities induced or compelled to raid patriotic manors, right? And just also to fuel division, right? Because of the anti-Catholic stand, and also from the other side, the historical Polish Judenhass, as a matter of fact. Now, after Dibich died of cholera, Field Marshal Ivan Paskevich took command. Between July and August 1831, he executed a broad envelopment crossing the Vistula near Osiek on pontoon bridges constructed with Prussian acquiescence, by the way, because the Prussians were at this point across the Vistula. They were a bit like, what are the Tsarists doing? We've seen this also with the Habsburgs before the Crimean War, like sending troops at the frontier, because you may never know. But again, it's the restoration context that makes it like, okay, let's put down these Poles, who the hell cares? Like, we partitioned the country. We all have a vested interest in this to go away, right? And that's where blood ran in rivers. So the Russians advanced via Yobin and Lwowicz to invest Warsaw from the west. General Gregor von Rosenkor's 12,000 men reached Praga from Brześć-Litewski on August the 10th. Theodor von Rüdiger's corps, other 12,000 men, took Radom after crossing upstream at Józefów. Warsaw was essentially surrounded at this point and defended by approximately 31,100 infantry and 38,000 cavalry, organized into two corps under Generals Henryk Dębinski and Jan Nepomucen Umiński, supported by 228 guns, including 21 Congreve rocket batteries that, as we've seen, the spare among Russian cavalry, right? So remember the parallelisms here, not just with the Napoleonic era, but with 100 years later, what happened on the Vistula, right? Even actually, like the Battle of Warsaw that we documented in the Polish Bolshevik War is just like 80 years away. It's that freaking close. This is amazing about the 19th century. That's why we have to talk more about its warfare. 3 concentric lines of field fortifications had been erected around the city. The innermost roughly followed the former Lubomirsky ramparts. The middle line stood 400-600 meters forward. The outermost curved from Jopi through Rakowitz, Wola, and Parisov to the Vistula. The strongest position was Fort 56, the Wola redoubt centered on St. Lawrence's Church and commanded by General Joseph Sowiński. The Tsarist assault commenced before first light on September the 6th. You have to hurry up also because bad weather arrives soon. At these latitudes, Paskevich massed over 380 guns against the western sector, concentrating on forts 54, 55, 56, and 57. After a 2-hour bombardment, infantry stormed the outer line. Fort 55 left ungarrisoned was occupied without opposition. Fort 54, held by 2 companies under Captain Franciszek Bobinski, fell after a magazine explosion killed more than 100 attackers, by the way. General Geismar among the severely wounded. Lunette Fort 57 resisted until its garrison of roughly 300 men was overwhelmed, with only about 80 taken alive. By midday, 3 Tsarist columns, Luders from the northwest, Martinov from the southwest, Berg from due south, assaulted Fort 56 from multiple directions. Sowiński's 1,660 defenders, reinforced by Piotr Bizowski's battalion from the 10th Line Infantry Regiment, repelled the first waves, but repeated assaults and envelopments finally penetrated the position. Sowiński himself fell on the ramparts. Approximately 1,230 Poles were captured, though isolated groups continued fighting until cut down. Russian losses at Wola alone exceeded 1,000 dead on the first day. On September the 7th, Tsarist artillery, now in place within the captured forts, bombarded the second line. Intense fighting developed around Chiste, forts 21 and 22, and the Jerozolimskie Gate. Polish Uhlans and mounted rifles, interesting units, delivered several counter-charges that temporarily checked Russian infantry columns. This means a lot because, again, they're essentially mounted skirmishers, but heavy infantry, infantry that is properly meant to break through to be decisive holes in front of them. Superior numbers, in fact, in artillery preparation were in fact what ultimately prevailed. After prolonged negotiations conducted by General Ignacy Przynski, General Jan Krukowicki authorized evacuation of Warsaw itself. On the evening of September the 7th, the Polish army crossed the Vistula toward Modlin and Plock. Tsarist forces entered Warsaw on September the 8th. The last substantial regular formation, more than 20,000 men under General Maciej Rybinski, crossed the Prussian frontier near Brodnica on October the 5th and was interned. Modlin capitulated on October the 9th, Zamość on October the 21st, 1831, bringing organized resistance to an end. Nicholas responded with the Organic Statute promulgated in 1832. The statute abolished the kingdom's remaining autonomy. So at this point, the Tsarists had this motivation to disband also what had been established 17 years before with a very different spirit, but it's also one of increasingly darker forces sort of prevailing in the repression of these movements, especially when you look at Tsarist force in perspective. They had been the enforcers also in other countries. By the way, as we've seen in the video about Franz Joseph for the 1848 revolution, was by far the biggest across Europe, right? And so wherever there was some liberty to crack down on the Tsarists were there, ready to send troops across Europe, even up to Spain, so on. Naturally, with the support of local powers, but this is an incredibly painful step that dissolved the Sejm and the separate Polish army. The Warsaw University was closed. because these had been largely responsible for the uprising in a political moral sense. The Tsarists erected a fortified citadel at the city's expense, imposed a severe customs barrier along the Polish-Russian frontier as well, introduced Tsarist coinage, weights, and measures after 1840, and inaugurated systematic Russification across administration, courts, and education. This would not actually prevent Polish nation to exist or to remain essentially largely untouched. And this is deeply important because Warsaw was reduced to the status of large military garrison under direct imperial control. As we've seen, outside of Warsaw, Poland was not particularly nor cohesive. They were literally under multiple powers that were cohesively keeping the Polish people under. But we're not that far away, if you think about it, from some greater resurgence. Without mentioning, Warsaw kept growing. It was one of the largest cities in Europe at some point, and this happened under the Tsarist regime for opportunistic reasons, including, however, the fact that the Poles could not be simply repressed. They needed them in a sense, because it was a great part of the Tsarist European, therefore the most important part of the empire. And they were just too many. You couldn't rule this land without giving something to it at some point. Also, little anecdote because of my avatar, von Clausewitz notoriously died on the Polish frontier, because as you've seen, the Prussians had mobilized, and the aforementioned cholera outbreak that had struck, and this was a pretty big thing, right, in the heartland of Europe, struck, as we've seen, the Russian army, but killed von Clausewitz, Gneisenau, the same Hegel, as a matter of fact. So it's really sort of traumatically sort of beautiful even to realize the real world in which these people were actually creating some of the greatest, as you know, theories in the history of mankind, properly understanding reality and dying at von Clausewitz of November the 16th of 1831. As you know, leaving also notes regarding the fact that while he was about to finish for good the Weltkrieg in a couple of months, by February, he estimated, the insights of the work were right. And there is, again, the meaning of the Polish insurrection of 1830-31 is naturally something we could discuss in another video. Given the broader impact, even among peoples we mentioned before, the same Polish army is spreading also towards the southeast, the same Polish government requiring to the Russians the participation of different peoples, including Ukrainians, Lithuanians. This is something we partially saw also in my series about Ukrainian history. There is also, because further revolts occurred, and aside from the January one, there is a deep connection of this national epopee, so to say, that resounds in different countries. National anthems, for example, that refer to these various uprisings. The same Polish one refers to other peoples that were struggling for independence. So the 19th century, we only recently began to look at this in more robust terms. We're mostly concentrating on Europe. Yes, I have a series on the US Civil War, but in general, 19th century history by now, this is the 36th video. It's not too much. Some it's just sort of incidental. We should keep talking also more about Napoleonic War, but there is a deep and brutal 19th century bloodshed all across the old continent that is somehow forgotten and still molded. Imagine if these things can say happen today, but I mean, what a big deal would it be for a people to be repressed in those terms, and to even escalate at this point in this warfare where, again, an entire country basically detached itself from an empire and managed to defy it on the battlefield on multiple occasions. So it's even a ramp of the entire country, but also it's really of a central symbol, right? Warsaw as already the former capital of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it's a beautiful as brutal history. The January Uprising is really fascinating. There are lots of connections. I don't know if you look at the history of different Chopins, for example, more and better, say, worse known as Chopin, owes in fact his French fame to the fact he was one of the Polish exiles, various expulsion, purges, and so on. So history is really heavy. Polish history is in many ways underrated. We will talk more about other events, other sort of independent, unifying struggles. We will talk more about Germany, Italy. The internal affairs of France, for example, very interesting. The same uprisings in the Iberian Peninsula are remarkable. So there is an entire European world in ferment that, if you look at this in perspective, really brought to the end of the Restoration order as it had been devised, namely never quite fundamentally held. Right, the French Revolution, Napoleonic era had really unhinged an incredible set of systems, of frameworks, of mentality. Again, for better and for worse, depending on what you're really looking at. The 19th century is not an easy century to teach at all. It's very complicated. It's very, especially still loaded with perspectives that are very close to us in ways that are difficult to sort of watch, look at with more detachment. Like you study even the history, I don't know, of the 7 Years' War. Like, even if you come from those countries, it's never like looking at the 19th century in so many different ways. It's very archetypal. It's very sort of tragic. It opened also to further tragic times. So people tend, in my opinion, when looking at these periods, to demonize certain principles, not looking at what they were actually seeking to do. It's not like saying, I don't know, communism works. No, it doesn't. In that case, it's the opposite of that. But I mean, there is an idea that, in fact, the revolutionary movements were devoid of thinking heads. The problem was that there were, but that the sort of broader moral force was too sort of big, considering the death of tradition, for the latter to truly control this in a more virtuous way. And the word that emerged from that, of course, brought to many advantages, but also was fundamentally unhinged. And as we see in times like today, like bringing to unprecedented crisis of values, of ideas, with people truly not really being able to fall back on anything that resembles even proper tradition, right? Much of the conservative movement we see today doesn't really have an idea. They're thinking like foretestators from the 19th century. They don't understand that they are radical, de facto communistic terrorists, that they have nothing, let's say, intelligent to say. That's also why they don't have any power, and they generally lose, because they don't understand that they're a product of something that in the 18th century, just in a broader aristocratic governmental sense, would have been considered unhuman, subhuman. And so this is the greatest lie, right? Thinking that, I don't know, a sovereign of the 18th century would have winked at you because you're part of the same nation. No, he thought that you were basically just barely above an animal, right? And he would have used you as such, right? So there were also, in that view, some defective degrees of application. That is the same reason why the ancien regime itself was actually weaker and sclerotic, ever weaker and sclerotic over time. So that's why it collapsed as well, because, you know, if the idea is right, you see, that's what people thing to do today. They put themselves into a box. It means that they're making the effort to make things work. No, they don't even know what that box is about. That's the problem. And again, this is also how you learn from history. The important part is how we're even trying to do so. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.